everybody, I'm going to be showing you how you can add texture to your weavings today, and there are a couple really simple and easy ways to do that, and then some more experimental and exploratory ways that I'll go over. So to get started, I'm just going to kind of tell you what I've got here. I have my cardboard loom, which this is one I actually made, so yours is probably going to be a little bit nicer than this, but we'll do the same thing. I have a nice sharp pair of scissors that happens to match my color scheme here. I have a fork, or you might have a comb or something similar to push your yarn together, and then a little tapestry needle. I'm going to be using for my warp thread today, which that's the thread that goes vertically on your loom. I'm going to be using this nice strong purple yarn, and just as a reminder, your warp thread should be able to stand the tug test here. It shouldn't break easily since you're going to be kind of pulling on it. You don't want it to snap. I also have a variety of different yarns here that I'm going to be weaving with. So I have just your sort of standard thickness of yarn that you can buy, at Michael's. Then I have some other yarns. This one is kind of feels like a wool. It's really soft, a little bit thicker. I have some other textured yarns that are textured themselves. So this kind of cool fuzzy yarn, some wool roving. This is a synthetic, it's not wool, actual wool, but has that nice puffy texture to it. I've cut some fabric strips, got some found objects, and yeah, some more just textured various thicknesses of yarn here, okay? So, to get started, I'm gonna warp the loom, and to do that, go through this quickly. You're just gonna start at one end, doesn't matter which one, of your loom, and hook your end piece of your warp thread through the first notch, and then you're gonna draw that string down to the notch directly below the one you started in. And I don't wrap all the way around. There are reasons why you might do that, but I actually, so I'll flip over to the back, I just hook around the notch next to it, and then I come back up to the notch directly across from that one. Showing you the back now, out of the way, hook, draw down, go through, hook, and back, okay? So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna just do that. And when you're done, you just trim that off. We'll set this aside, and our loom is warped and ready to go. Make sure, hopefully when you're pulling through, you were kind of pulling it tightly, not too tight, but tight enough so that there's kind of a snap to it, and your weft threads aren't going to be loose. All right, so for texture, let's start with some of the just really easy ways you can create texture in your weaving, okay? So as I mentioned earlier, you're gonna have some yarn that's just sort of your standard yarn sort of thickness that you get from the store. And I'm gonna just pull off a length of that, or cut off a piece of that to get started with. Start showing you some different techniques. So I'm going to just do a simple plain weave, which is just over and under each warp thread, and I start at the bottom. Usually leave myself a little bit of space to tie off, so I'm going to start about an inch or so up. So I go under, over, under, over, under, over, until I get all the way across. Pull the yarn all the way through. Sometimes people will just start going back, which is fine. Another great thing about weaving, it's very easy to fix, but what you want to do is actually pull that whole thread through until you just have a little kind of tail hanging out at the other end, and all you're gonna do, or all I do, is just tuck that in. And by that I just mean like I weave it in a few warp threads like so, and kind of push it together. So I'm gonna do another row of plain weave, and I wanna alternate. So since I ended over this last thread, I need to go under it on my next pass through. And again, continuing to just alternate over and under, and then pulling that yarn through all the way to the other side. You want to make sure you can kind of just hold your thumb on this end so that you can evenly pull that yarn through. And you could do a couple techniques. You could do a diagonal or kind of a bubbling technique, and then push your yarn together. What you don't want to do is pull super hard on it and then create kind of uneven edges. That's going to happen a little bit naturally, but you can prevent that by kind of holding that thread in place as you pull it through, and then again creating I messed up the other side. Creating a diagonal, or again a sort of bubbled shape like that. And what that does is it builds in a little bit of extra length, so when you're pushing it together, it's not pulling in on your ends. Okay, so this is your basic plain weave, and you can see it just, you can see the warp threads pretty clearly, and there is some texture here, but this is, it's pretty flat. So one super easy way you can add texture is to double up the thread. And what I mean by that is, say I like this turquoise, but I want it to be a little bit thicker, but I don't have a thicker yarn. So all I'm gonna do is double it up. You could even triple it, okay? And that's gonna make a thicker yarn in a sense. So I do the same thing. I thread it through my needle, just as a double strand, and then I can continue weaving, and then you'll get to see the difference in the thickness here. Tuck it in my ends. And you can already sort of start to see how going from the single strand to the double strand, is creating a different sort of texture or thickness to the weaving. I'm gonna do it one more time. And this is all, again, this is using a very simple technique. The plain weave technique is just your kind of basic weaving stitch, and then your basic yarn just doubled up. Okay, when I'm done with a piece, I tuck it in, and then I just sort of trim off any extra. And these little pieces hanging out, if there's any extra hanging out, you can just kind of trim those off as well. They're not going to go anywhere. Okay. So another simple way to add texture is by using yarns that are more textured or a different thickness. So let me, I'll use this one. Okay, this one is a multicolored, it's really pretty kind of yarn. And this one's already a little bit thicker, but again, if I wanted to feel even puffier or thicker, more textured, I could double up the yarn. Cut a piece off. And I'm going to show you a different technique with this. So right before we did the plain weave, but I'm going to show you another one called, let's do Rya knots. Okay, Rya, R-Y-A. So Rya, it's called a knot, even though it's not really a knot in the sense that you would think about where you're, you know, tying a knot. You're kind of more just threading your yarn through the work threads to create a loose sort of knot, but it's not going to go anywhere. So you can start at one end, and you're going to work with 2 warp threads at a time. Okay, so I'm just going to focus on these 2 on end here. So I'm going to take my needle. It's helpful to have a needle for this. I'm going to actually go, instead of starting under on this side, I'm going to go through the middle. Okay, again, just of these 2 threads here. We'll go through the middle, which would be here, around the back of the left thread, pull my yarn through until I have a length that I like, and so I think I'm going to do kind of leave these tassels. These will create tassels sort of long, so I like that length. And then I'm going to go bring it around the front basically, so going over the front of these 2 threads, around the back of the right thread, and then pulling through the middle. So we started in the middle, went around, and we're kind of looping back through the middle. And I'll do that a couple times. And then you kind of just gently pull on it, and it creates that kind of appearance of a knot, right? But we never actually tied a knot in a sense. When you're using Rya, you do always need some kind of base under it, so the plain weave that we just did kind of can serve as that base. All right, so made that knot, so then I'm going to move on to my next 2 warp threads, and I'm still on this piece of yarn here. So again, I'm going to go and start in the middle, go around the back of the left thread, pull it through, and then I'm going to kind of line it up with that other length that I left, so it's approximately the same length. I'm going to come around the front of the 2 threads, go behind the right thread, and then pull through the middle. Just like that. And we'll start to see some tassels forming. All right, and do one more. Around the back. Loop through the front, pull through the center, and you can kind of see this shape that's forming here, where we have, again, the yarn going behind, looping in front, and then coming back through the center and pulling. And you could do this as many times as you like. Again, another way to add texture, I could have doubled this yarn over again on itself, so it was 4 strands, so that would have made a really, you know, thick Rya knot. And then you just go through and you cut the loops, although you might like the loops too, so you don't have to. You cut through any little loops you made, and now you've created some fringe. So another way to create texture pretty quickly is to use, again, a textured yarn. So I have some of this kind of chenille yarn. I also have this really soft, fluffy yarn that I love that has this kind of fun fringe to it. You may have, I believe you got, some different ribbons and yarns with pom-poms on it. So some other things you can think about trying just, from your home even, or like I mentioned, ribbon or trim like lace, anything where the thread or the yarn itself that you're using is textured, right? And that's going to add texture naturally. So I'm going to use this fluffy white yarn, and I'm going to double it up because I want it to feel really puffy. And I'm going to show you a version of the plain weave called the basket weave. And the only difference with the basket weave is that a basket weave is over 2, under 2. So for plain weave, or tabby is another thing you might hear plain weave called, but for plain weave, it's over under 1 work thread. So all this is over under 2 work threads. And then pulling through, pushing together, tucking in my tail, and back. So I ended under, so I want to go over on the next pass, under, over, pull through. If you need to, again, do the bubble, create the bubble so that you're not pulling in on your edges of your weaving too much. All right, continue to do that a few times to build up that texture. You'll notice with this one, whereas the first yarn I used, I can still see the warp threads. I can see this purple warp coming through. This one's really thick and it's pretty much covering the warp threads, which is fine. But that's just kind of another look you can get. Feels a little more full. And I'm gonna do some tapestry and start to create a shape. So instead of going all the way across, I'm gonna stop about halfway through and go back. So I can sort of create a little square here, and then I'll be able to add another color or texture next to it. I am just using my hands to push the yarn together, which you can do too, or if you find the comb easier, that's fine. Alright, and I tucked it through, and so you see I created this fuzzy shape here. Push some of these together, okay? Alright, so that is 3 different ways. So we learned 3 different techniques, right? Plain weave, rya knots, and basket weave. Okay, but all using various thicknesses and textures of yarn. So doubling up on yarn, using a thicker yarn, or using a textured yarn. All right, so I'm going to show you another technique called sumac, which can be done with any thickness of thread, but I think it yields kind of the nicest effect when you use it with wool roving. And I think I mentioned earlier that this is a synthetic wool roving, just meaning it's not actual wool, but I just ordered a pack off of Amazon, so it's not quite as soft as actual wool would be, but it has this nice puffy texture, and you can get it in all kinds of thicknesses. So I've pulled off a few pieces of this, and sumac, it can seem kind of complicated, but once you get the hang of it, it starts to make a lot more sense. So I'm going to start by going under. I'm going to work with 2 warp threads at a time again, just like I did for the raya. And I'm going to start by going under those 2 threads, kind of pulling through, and then looping, just making a little loop back around those threads, just like that. And then I'm going to go to the next set of 2, loop around, and kind of push together. And the next set of 2, loop around, push together, and again, and again. Tuck that in there. Okay. You see it created that kind of nice spiral. And if I wanted to create a braided effect, I could do the same thing. But then instead of, so when I did this one, right, when I did this row, I went around and I pulled up, but instead of pulling up, I can go around and pull down. You'll see how that will create a different look. So just kind of making a braid. So taking my 2 threads, wrapping around, looping around, but then instead of pulling up to the top like I did before, I'm pulling through to the bottom. And these little pieces just have to sort of tuck and weave in. And that created a really nice, puffy, sort of braided texture. You don't have to do the braid, you could just continue to layer going the same direction, and that'll, you know, create other effects. Or you could actually even go back too, which could be interesting, you know, alternating the color each time you change the direction too, and that can give you some really fun effects. Okay, so last couple of things I'm going to show you. One is using fabric strips. This is cut off from old clothes, and kind of just like when you're using the textured yarn, using fabric, right, it's just going to give you a different effect and a different texture. And something I do like about fabric is that it will kind of fray on the ends, so I like that sort of fringe that creates. So if I did just want to use, you know, a little piece, maybe I'll go back to plain weave. Just weave that through, and you can use fabric with any of these techniques. You could do fabric raya knots, you could do fabric basket, plain weave, sumac. I could tuck this in, or maybe I kind of like that raw edge. You could just leave them out and create kind of fringe that way. I may go back in even with this piece here and add some more raya knots with the fabric, if it'll tear. Let's see. Okay. This one maybe. Thread this through. Add a little wire knot here. That one even has a pattern on it, so that kind of adds an interesting look. Another one. And even though I've already woven here, like I mentioned, you can always use your tapestry needle and just kind of spread apart the yarn to add in things like raya knots. I tend to change up my weavings a lot, so now that I've woven more even, I don't know how much I like this color, so I might take that out and do that again. So weaving is very flexible in that sense that you can, you know, easily, if I didn't like how this looks, I could just pull it out and weave something else in. And let me add this piece from earlier, so I'm gonna add this back. This was actually a piece that I pulled out of the original rye I had there, so let's see. Some other things you might want to try adding texture with. You could go outside, and it's very rainy today, otherwise I would have gone and collected some sticks and leaves maybe to add in. So natural elements, or you think of something like bamboo, or maybe those plants like those kind of reeds or flat leaves. Pretty much anything that is, you know, more or less flat can be woven into your warp threads, right? I grabbed these little, these are just some pieces of glass. So if I wanted to, I could tie this on here, and I can do that with yarn, or I have some of this copper wire, so I might kind of want to see how that looks. So I'm gonna just thread this through, see if it cooperates. Okay, here we go. And then wrap this on here. You could weave with wire. Sometimes it's fun to just go, you know, somewhere like the Scrap Exchange or a thrift store or Habitat for Humanity and check out, you know, what are some different found objects and materials that you can experiment with. I have woven, I've added chopsticks, people do straws, I've done nails before, I saw someone use film strips. I'm trying to think of what other kinds of interesting things I've seen. Yeah, I mean, there are pretty much endless possibilities with weaving, which is something I love about it. All right, I could probably get that on there a little better, but you get the gist. That you can use wire or thread may have been easier to just kind of tie on this little found object. Could even probably, like if I'd gone up here, I could have, you know, woven this in even. And then I can weave around it. Actually, let me try that. So, and if you have any little loose pieces hanging off that are driving you crazy, he said you can just trim these little tails that were tucked in off. Okay, they'll be fine. I'm also gonna take these out because I no longer like that color. I do want something there, so I'm gonna finish up here and then I will think about what color I want to add there. So for around this piece, maybe I'll bring this teal back like that. And I guess similarly to how I did earlier when I was making a shape, you know, this I'm just gonna sort of weave around it. Now I am weaving up to the top here, and you may want to, but most of the time you remove the weaving from the loom. So this would get cut off and, you know, you might leave the loop so you can hang it. You could thread a stick or a dowel through it. You might tie knots on it. You can also think of the loom sort of as a frame. Something to frame your weaving as well. You can get creative with that. Right, and I'm going to tuck this in now. And so you see I sort of made a shape around that, and if I want to go... Okay, and so I finished up this little section around this piece of glass and then added a few more colors and textures, just playing around with fabric, weaving with the wool roving that we did the sumac technique up here earlier with, and then adding some raya knots back, which I actually did upside down, you can see. So when you flip it the other way, it creates an even different effect. So just as a review, we did plain weave, over under, 1 warp thread, basket weave, over under 2 warp threads, sumac, which was the looping around sets of warp threads, raya knots, which is again working with 2 warp threads and creating tassels or fringe, as well as tapestry. So that's tapestry is anytime you're making and connecting shapes within a weaving. And then playing around with various materials, doubling up your yarn, using texture yarn, or trim, ribbon, lace, adding bound objects that can add texture, wire, sticks, rocks, whatever. We use wool roving and then cut fabric strips from clothing. So all of that created this kind of crazy weaving, textured weaving sample.